My name is Avery Gordon, and I'm very pleased to, I'm going to introduce our panel and the participants, although I'm not, I'm just going to point them out in case you don't know who they are, because their information is really right going behind them. This session is going to be, I think, a little bit different than the last session, which was incredibly moving, but it's going to look at the Institute's kind of long-standing efforts to try to understand the experiences and also the socioeconomic causes of state violence, and particularly by the police and other kinds of prison authorities that Black and migrant communities routinely experience, and the work the Institute's done also to try to stop that. And so we have a great group of people in this session, and it's hard to kind of participate. This is Harmit, for those of you who don't know who she is. Harmit was also one of the authors of the Dying for Justice report, which we're going to talk about. Eddie, who is sitting in the center, who, I'm not sure what it says about Eddie up there, but he is, among the other things it says up behind him, there is an expert on deaths in custody in Germany and in Europe, and Francis, to my far right, who is vice chair of the council, and I don't know what it says behind you yet, co-author of also the second report. So if you were, I think everybody was here just this morning listening, right? Is any new people who just came in? So you might have remembered hearing Siva say that there's racism that discriminates and racism that kills, and that the Institute has been interested in the racism and the xeno-racism that kills. Well, 23 years ago, the Institute produced a report called Deadly Silence, Black Deaths in Custody, which was one of the first account of 75 people killed between in the 1970s and the 1980s while in the hands of the police. And that early report detailed the institutional racism, the lack of official responsibility and accountability, and also the very courageous and dogged work of the families of those who were killed to get some kind of answers and to get some measure of justice. So just this month, the Institute has produced 2 new reports. One is called Dying for Justice, that's been edited by Harmit and Jenny Bourne, who's just speaking with you. And it basically picks up where Deadly Silence left off, and documents that since 1991, at least 509 people from VME refugee and migrant communities have died in what we euphemistically call suspicious circumstances while they've been in the hands of the police, prison, or immigration detention authorities. So how that situation is the same, how it's different from this earlier time, whether communities and families and loved ones are any more likely to get redress and justice. This is what the report addresses, and what especially Harmit and Eddie can address very directly. This is a fantastic report. Harmit was just holding it up. Yes, and glossy, fancy, so on. But it also includes a lot of other great contributions from Ruth Bundy and Lee Bridges, who's here, I know he's in there, Deborah Coles, Ken Farrow, and also the IR's own Ryan, who's also in it. So that's the first report. The second report is also a new report, which I Francis is holding it up, that's great. That's sponsored by the IRR's European Research Program, and it's been prepared by Reem, just walking in as her name is being spoken, and Francis Weber, and it's entitled Unwanted, Unnoticed, and it's an analysis of the policies that have led to 160 asylum and immigration related deaths in Europe between January 2010 and 2014. And many of you might be familiar with the thousands of migrants and refugees from Africa and from Western Asia and Middle East who are drowned each year trying to reach Europe. This report is actually about those who managed to survive the journey and then who nonetheless find themselves living on the margins and who are dying prematurely in really unnecessary and quite distressing circumstances. And so these are also deaths that require a kind of public accountability and a struggle to try to end that fortress of Europe. The title of this session is called Why Do We Count Deaths? And counting deaths is always about more than just counting. And so what we've asked the panelists to do is to each just take a few minutes to begin by answering the question of why they count deaths in the work they do. In other words, what motivates the work that they've done, why it matters to them. And so they're each going to speak for around 5 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for a discussion, perhaps between them a little bit, and certainly to you. So, Harmit, are you comfortable to begin?
Okay.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go sit over here out of the way now. Okay.
So, as well as researching deaths in custody at the Institute, which Avery's already mentioned, I also research racially motivated murders and the deaths of asylum seekers and migrants in the community. And I don't know if I should say this, but I will, but Siva used to jokingly call me the Grim Reaper. I first came to London to volunteer at the Institute and spent 9 odd months going through cuttings and classifying them. I have to say it was quite boring work, but I was always reading, and that in itself was an education, learning about racism in all of its forms. And one of the main reasons that I wanted to volunteer at the Institute was I wanted to become more politically active, but I wasn't really interested in student politics at my university at the time. So I asked to do my year out at the Institute, and they said yes. And coming to the Institute was an education on many levels. One of the ways that Siva explained the IRR's work to me was one of his aphorisms, which you might have seen flashing across the screen earlier, and it's this one: there are 2 racisms, the racism that discriminates and the racism that kills, which said to me that the Institute was more interested in the racism that killed people, from the racist attacks to the deaths in custody, than the racism that discriminates. And one of the first pieces of work that they asked me to do, other than to classify cuttings, was to compile a list of deaths, updating deadly silence, which was the IRR's first pamphlet on deaths in custody. And at this time, this is 1995, I was living in Clapham and just round the corner from where Brian Douglas was pulled over by 2 police officers and hit over the head with a newly introduced American-style baton, and he was taken to Kennington Police Station and then to hospital, where he later died. I also became involved in that campaign, which was started by his family after his death. So at work, I was reading and writing about deaths in custody, and then in my own backyard, someone was killed, and I was trying to campaign around that. As my colleagues will tell you, I've become an avid collector of cuttings, and as anyone knows who's been to our office, they'll tell you there's always piles of cuttings around my desk. And it's been going through those cuttings, reading official reports, attending inquests and the demos called by families, that has exposed the racism that's inherent in the structures in our society. The callous way that the state and its agents, the police and prison officers, or the G4S guards treat people who are deemed disposable because of their colour of their skin. And it's by going through these cases that the patterns are highlighted that show the same mistakes that are being repeated again and again. And the Institute is about highlighting racism in practice, the racism inherent in the systems and structures that govern our lives. And yes, it is depressing work, and yes, it is depressing to see how slowly things have changed. But things are changing, and I have to say it's mainly down to the families and their long campaigns for justice that has led to changes in the system. So that's why I write and research and campaign around such deaths, to try and help effect some change, and in the hope that our work can be used as ammunition for campaigning and to expose the injustices suffered by bereaved families. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm Eddie, and I'm the newest member of the council at the IRR. So I'm really excited to be speaking at this event where we get to really look back at some of the important changes that the IRR has brought about in the UK. By my accent, you can also tell I'm not from the UK. So this is especially interesting for me because the expertise that I have about deaths in custody, counting deaths, and looking at racism has been mainly in the US and Germany. And I actually should say mainly in Germany. So for the last 10, 12 years, I've been looking at policing and racial violence in Germany. And it's a really fascinating question. Why do we count? And also, what are we doing when we're counting deaths? For me, the first thing that comes to mind in Germany is proving to people we're not crazy, or proving to people that we're actually seeing something that exists. And I say that partly because the type of work that Harmit and the Institute have done in counting deaths in the UK is not being done in Germany, and to some extent it's difficult to mobilize some sort of record keeping and counting in Germany that would basically make those types of records publicly available, and that would disaggregate the number of people who die in police custody or in immigration detention along the lines of race, or along the lines of any type of proxy to race that one might think about in this country. So national origin or ethnicity or those types of things. Because in Germany, those records aren't kept because the idea of difference along the line of race is something that isn't as rigorously followed up on by the government. So those statistics are not really readily available to people. So in Germany, counting deaths is already a problem. We can't really count them in a way that's accurate. But we nonetheless try to count them because it provides traction in the daily practice of anti-racist struggle. So the deaths that we can actually commit to a record and to institutional memory become wildly important, even when we know the figures are completely reported, and even when the counting process really becomes a way to get people to look at an issue that they know exists beneath the surface. So it's to show the pattern, it's to commit these ideas to institutional memory, and it's also to show the grieving families that they're not alone. And this is in a context where the government is much less transparent. This is in a context where there is no inquest process, so there's no Article 2 inquest that follows up deaths in custody. And it's in a place where the police and the court systems have a large degree of faith by the public. So there's not a lot of critical inquiry into what they do. But then I think another part of me thinks that we count in order to figure out where we are as a society. So what are we counting when we're counting deaths? We realize that we're only counting one system in a larger structure of violence, of racism, of the state's ability to coerce people to do what they want them to do. So we're looking at deaths, but we're really also counting other things. We're counting, the way that I think activists in this type of struggle are oriented is to think about time and to think about the numbers in these cases as formative. So if I say 41 bullets to any one person in the United States who kind of cares about policing, they'll think of 41 shots fired by the NYPD. If you say 13 feet or with meters or feet of duct tape in this country, one thinks about Joy Gardner. If you think of 6 million deaths, you think of the Holocaust. 12 million deaths, you think of Toni Morrison's introduction to Beloved, where she reflects on the dead. And this is a way to connect to stories, and it's a way to connect our stories to one another. If we think about time and space in a way that is attuned to what we can count, it opens our minds to being able to look at what we can't count, and maybe looking beyond just the numbers of deaths to some sort of way to deal with structures. And I'll mention one thing to be aware of or to be skeptical of when we count deaths is the idea that in order to have a crisis, we need to have a large number. And that's something I think we might fall into a trap of thinking, because this crisis model doesn't really capture the entirety. It captures a tip of an iceberg, and even that tip is something that we're maybe not measuring properly. But it's, of course, useful and vital to do the counting, but then not to think that that counting is the product. Like Sivan said, I think in the interview with Avery, it's what you do with the knowledge. It's not just thinking to think, it's what you actually do with it. And so in Germany, if I say 10 people have died in custody in the last 10 years under egregious circumstances, people don't tend to bat an eye until you say, well, there's a lot of other issues that we need to be thinking about around those deaths that actually make us quite concerned. So I guess that's where my research is now, figuring out how we use the numbers that we've accumulated.
Yes. Thanks, Eddie. I guess, one of Siva's aphorisms, which was up there earlier, was one death is a death too many. Harmit reminded me, I'd forgotten, 1969, cuttings. That's how I started at the Institute, was doing cuttings. And so I've done a kind of a circular route. Siva kicked me out after a year, said, you've got to go to university, get the tools of the system to beat the system, another aphorism. So I became an immigration lawyer. And so obviously was dealing with migration issues, the politics of migration. You can imagine that immigration law is the most political area of law. So then it was natural when I retired to come back into the Institute, to my kind of spiritual political home. And Reem did most of the work on this report, which is what I'm just briefly going to talk about in this context. Why do we count deaths? Avery mentioned the fact that the issue of deaths at the borders of Europe has finally, after decades, or I would think it is decades, isn't it, since about 92, has finally become an issue on the political agenda, finally being noted and reported. And there's a glimmer of concern and that perhaps EU policies on Fortress Europe are somehow responsible for what's happening, and that perhaps the EU has a responsibility to rescue the people who are drowning. So we looked at deaths of people who have arrived in Europe and who one would expect that they could say, thank God, I'm here now, I've made it. And what our report, I think, uncovers is the continuing sort of horror, the being in limbo, the fact that there's no reception facilities, that the EU Reception Directive, which is supposed to create minimum standards for the reception of asylum seekers, is ignored pretty well in a lot of European countries, that people are detained in the UK for indefinitely. People are detained because they're migrants, because they're asylum seekers. They can be detained for sort of up to 4 years. And so all of these issues are behind these deaths, which engage European countries' responsibility even more directly because of the Reception Directive, because these deaths occur in detention, in reception, or in squats like this because France hasn't built enough reception centres. and so people have to live in spots like that and light fires to keep warm and die as a result of the fires. So the report is intended to galvanise groups around Europe as part of the European Research Programme, which was set up by Liz, getting on for 22 years ago, I think. The European Race Audit, which was the precursor of the European Research Programme. And what Liz has done is to create a network of volunteers all around Europe from whom we get information, and we then put out the reports all over Europe. And so the idea is to galvanise people all over Europe, activist groups, to ask questions, because one of the striking things about this report was how difficult it was to get the information, how there are not centralised, that there aren't these structures of accountability in many European countries, which have been built in the UK through the struggles of activists, families, migrant groups and so on, so that for every death, at least in an immigration removal centre, the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman has to investigate. So those kinds of structures of accountability didn't just happen. They came out of years of campaigning and years of struggle. And so we have, albeit imperfectly, we have some structures of accountability in the UK for which we can be proud. And it's important that other... I think in Germany, there are we found a lot of deaths in Germany, so there must be a lot of activist groups who are reporting on these deaths, even if there aren't those structures. But in other countries, there seems to be maybe too much trust sometimes between the NGOs, or the NGOs have too much sort of faith in government structures. So anyway, we want to galvanise groups to ask questions, because only by getting this basic information, just knowing how many people died, and it's striking that since this report came out, and as a result of the report coming out, we've had people coming back to us saying, there's more deaths in Italy than you've recorded. There's more deaths in Norway than you've recorded. So we're getting more information. And so already it's working in the sense it's not supposed to be definitive. It's not supposed to be exhaustive audit. It's to galvanise people to ask these questions. So if you don't know how many, you don't know names, you don't know nationalities, you don't know who the people were. You need to know these things. There's a very influential and important book by Sharon Pickering and Leanne Weber, which talks about this, deaths and counting and structures of accountability. You can only have accountability through the process of accounting, which means accounting both in terms of who people are who died and how they died and how the state is accountable. So, because racism is behind, just in the same way as racism, racist attitudes is behind allowing people to drown in the Mediterranean, and saying, well, we're not going to rescue people because it will just encourage more. So racism is behind these deaths, the idea that certain people's lives don't matter. And that's really what we're combating, or trying to.
Can I just can I ask, just to ask you all to say one more word before we take some questions, because one of the things that's very striking in both reports is in some ways the gap between the counting and any kind of accountability at the level of justice. In other words, you know, now there are inquests, you know, that are delivering verdicts of unlawful killings in a small number of the cases, but no conviction. That still, in order to get any kind of public accountability beyond what's coming from the grassroots struggle still has to be there. So I wondered if you might speak a little bit about the struggle still at this level in terms of both reports, or both what's happening with migrants and what's happening with. Sorry, I'm just saying, in the case of both groups of people we're talking about.
Well, I mean, in terms of the UK, for most families, what they would ideally want is to see a police or prison officer convicted. And the last time that actually happened was in 1969, 1971, when 2 police officers were convicted over the death of David Wallach. So, I mean, when you look at a statistic like that, it leaves you quite cold. It makes you wonder what can change. But then at the same time, you've seen the CPS prosecute the officers involved in the death of Jimmy Mabenga. We've got prosecution in May for the officers involved in the death of Azal Rodney. So things are changing, but I think for most families, what they would like to see is a police or a prison officer sent to prison for manslaughter of a loved one. I think for most families, that is what they want. Someone jailed, held accountable.
I think with the deaths that we have reported on in terms of migrants and asylum seekers, obviously Jimmy Mabenga's is a, if you like, a straightforward case that it's a police restraint or an officer restraint, which leads to charges in a way that a lot of the deaths can't lead to charges, because a lot of them are suicides. An awful lot of the deaths here are suicides, or they're medical neglect. There's somebody going into a detention centre or a reception centre with a condition that's not recognised, or with a heart condition which just isn't treated, and people banging on the door for hours and nobody coming, ambulances not being sent for, or like in Spain, where undocumented migrants suddenly in 2012 were no longer eligible for non-emergency treatment, health treatment. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? There's similar things going on around Europe. So Alpha Pam died of untreated tuberculosis, having gone to the clinic, I think, about 7 times and was being refused treatment. So why are these not crimes? They're not crimes. You know, that's something we could think about. Why are some deaths, why don't they result in criminal responsibility?
And then there's this tension between wanting the deaths acknowledged and wanting the truth to actually be explored to its full extent, and wanting those deaths to be honored, and the conflict that I think people have, especially in communities of color, where the expansion of the criminal justice system is kind of something that we don't want to be railing on about convictions. But those are tensions that always will exist, where there's a disproportionate acknowledgement of the death of certain groups, when the criminal justice system is actually the remedy that seems to symbolically be what will actually lead to acknowledgement. but I can't help but think about the quote by Sivan that was, they break our legs and then give us crutches. It's kind of like we would ideally not have the deaths in the first place. And I hope that this type of reporting can also be used for more thoroughgoing structural change before the deaths actually happen. So that's very idealistic.
Yeah, no, this is, I think, going to be a really huge issue heating up. I mean, one of the really startling findings of the Dying for Justice report is how many deaths, the majority of deaths, are taking place now in prison. And so for prison to be the solution to deaths in prison is a problem. And it's a problem because, of course, the scope of social abandonment, political authoritarianism, in the context of neoliberalism and global crisis is making, of course, imprisonment a social solution. So that spin becomes a really important one for how to think about the question of justice. I agree. I think so. Shall we take some questions, comments from the audience? Yes,
Beverly, I think. Beverly.
Beverly Clark. I'd just like to ask, how much does organised crime, e.g. trafficking, influence this non-accountability? In that, I've been watching documentaries where Africans are trafficked into Europe, like say Italy, for different purposes, by gangs and so on. This underworld element, how much does that account for them not being counted?
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah.
Do you want to answer?
Yeah, I think it's that if you look at the whole history in the EU level, that the whole question of trafficking and smuggling becomes sort of instrumentalised as an excuse for the states to do sort of dreadful things. So, I mean, I remember when Jack Straw got up years and years ago and was sort of saying that we're going to bring in all these awful measures because this is a way to stop the traffickers and the smugglers. I think that's really what your question is about, that the trafficking becomes an excuse for states not to be responsible for how they treat people when they come here.
Yeah.
Can I just climb on the back of that just for a second? It seems to me, yes, what you're looking at is somebody filling a gap. People are fleeing Africa because their lives are hell. Their lives are hell because they're inside a global system that is partly responsible for generating the things in which they have. Nobody is helping them to get out of the shitholes that they're in. The only people who step forward, yes, to do so are the people we're calling traffickers and criminals. Into that gap, everywhere, not just in this situation, into those sorts of gaps left by the responsible states, step people we call criminals. So in fact, what we're looking at is the gap. Yes, is exactly what Eddie and Kevin has been talking about. The non-responsiveness to the people we talk about as authorities. Their non-responsiveness, because somehow these people are not quite as holy people as real people. Yeah?
Thank you. We jump to the next one. Okay, hold on.
The lady with the blue, I mean, yes. My apologies, I mean, I'm not familiar with this setting, although I should be. I used to know a guy called Trevor Carter, I think you all know who he is, or was, I should say. But I find your question very interesting, which you posed to the one on the extreme end. And I'm wondering the underlying motive for it. I'm not questioning your motive, but because there's a parallel to the police officer that was arrested for murder some years ago, which you mentioned. You remember you said, I think it's 79 or something like that?
Oh, David Olawale.
Yes. Now, in America, there's a lynching going on here, going on there, I should say. And I'm not too sure of the time frame when we can recall that a single policeman has been charged in America for the murder. Now, that happened recently. And I'm wondering if there's a parallel between the question that has been asked, because the story would not end there. I think we are very, we are disenchanted over the way in which, police are dying, men are dying in police custody in Britain behind the walls, but in America they are doing it on the street openly. It's not an issue anymore. It's a more sophisticated method that is being conducted here. And I'm wondering if you could probably help us to elaborate whether her answer is finished by saying, well, yes, that happened there, and not looking at the mirror which is taking place and has taken place very recently in the United States, where a policeman has been charged, I think, and I can go into more into it, but I'm hoping that I'm making points already.
Okay, I just will maybe take some other questions first. I feel there's about 7 hands that have just come up. But I hear your question. I wasn't suggesting a need to make a comparison.
No, I made that clear. So it's not a question of suggesting anything subliminally. I just find it a very interesting question.
My question is really more about the question of justice and accountability, and wanting them to say something about that before we moved on, since in this report, Dying for Justice, the vast majority of this report is about what happens after people die, and the incredibly difficult and fraught process, not just of getting information, but of getting any kind of justice or redress. And so it was just kind of prompting the panelists a little bit to put that question on the table for discussion. I mean,
Thank you very much.
that's all. Okay, so
John Grayson from South Yorkshire Migration Asylum Action Group. I'd just like to relate the debate to kind of current struggles, really. The Wenger case is classic in the sense that it relates to how that IRR has worked over the years. Because I think Francis mentioned the relationship between struggle and exposing the meanings of these deaths. And I think you did also, galvanise and ask questions. And I think the Wenger case, in terms of our work in Sheffield and South Yorkshire, specifically in the realm of asylum housing at present, exposing what's happening there. The actual campaign was kicked off in Sheffield by a Zimbabwean asylum housing tenant. Of course, looking at G4S, looking at the Wenger case, and G4S, of course, took over the housing in Yorkshire and Humberside in 2012, and it was privatised. This guy stood at a meeting and said, I don't want a bloody prison guard as my landlord. And that kind of relationship between G4S, the Wenger case, and the struggle against asylum housing has been key to the actual mobilisation, not only of activists, but of asylum seeker tenants themselves, etc. And I think that's a concrete example, perhaps, of how the research exposing deaths in custody, or that case when someone's been actually deported, but how that can actually then relate to social movement struggles, relate to actual campaigns. I just thought I mentioned that because I think how this relates to current practice, I think should be a theme of the day as well.
Yeah, thanks, John.
can you give the mic to Lee behind you, since he's right there?
I'm Lee Bridges. I've been tied up with the Institute ever since I first came to Britain, because somebody wanted to send me 10,000 miles in the other direction in 1968. Some of you are old enough to know what I'm talking about. And I came into the Institute because the LSE got shut down that year. And I needed a library where I could study racial issues. And I met Siva, and I've been related to the Institute ever since in one way or another, including for a period working at the Institute as a volunteer and as an employee, the period when I couldn't be on the council. What I want to mention here is that these two reports are part of a long tradition of the Institute. It goes back certainly to police against black people, policing against black people, deadly silence, etc. And the methodology is something that Siva actually promulgated. which was we turn cases into issues and issues into causes. And these aren't just counting the deaths, they're telling the story of the deaths.
Yeah.
And Siva was always insistent when I worked there, and I'm sure it's still the tradition, you can never put a case in a report unless you're damn sure of your facts. And so yes, there are many more deaths than either of these reports contain because you couldn't document them. But the point was always to tell the story of these deaths, the facts of these deaths, in order to draw out the issues that they raised, and then to take those issues up as causes, etc. Whereas academics use case studies simply as a way of trying to draw out theories and skip anything in between. And it's a tribute to Siva that these two reports are there almost without acknowledgement of that whole tradition that he established in the Institute. And I do think there is a point here that it's very important that these reports, and they do support the causes of the families who are campaigning. And for one thing, it makes them realize that they are not alone. There are other campaigns, there are other deaths that raise the same issues. And it's quite right that they want accountability in a very specific way. But it is important that we look beyond the accountability that may or may not come through the criminal justice system. And if you read my contribution to the deaths in custody report here, you'll know that I actually am somewhat suspicious that it would be very difficult to obtain successful prosecutions against people who kill agents of the state, who kill people because of the way the law is framed, and that's also true in the States. And we need to raise those issues because it's only by changing the law, the practice of the state, that we're going to actually stop the state breaking people's legs and killing them.
Yes, the gentleman with the green striped shirt. That's. Yes, you. So yes, don't you have a green striped shirt on?
He does. He
You
does.
got it.
He's
You do.
got a green shirt.
From here, it looks like it's stripy.
This man.
Okay, I'm Indrajit Meja. I bring greetings from Sandra, who used to be a cutter, who used to do the cutting at I'm sorry she can't be here this afternoon because she's in Istanbul attending a family wedding and doing some research at the same time. I wanted to make two comments. Of course, we're very fond of Siva and the rest of the team, Jenny, Liz and others. The issue for me is I'm really upset and heartbroken really about Cameron's support for the rescue of people fleeing persecution and other things from other countries in the Mediterranean. He's complicit in withdrawing that support. The Italians are looking out, asking for that support. And this morning, it's well documented that Katie Hopkins has gone on the offensive. She said, I would send in gunships rather than rescue ships for these people. And this is the narrative that we are dealing with in this country during the election, which is the most indecisive in the century, well, for about 50, 60 years, if ever. This is a narrative to which all the political parties are trying to outbid each other. The Labour Party's come out saying they're going to set up a specialist unit in the Home Office as a response to this. UKIP, they're well known for their views, and the NHS, you talked about the Spanish withdrawing their support for migrants coming into in Spain in 2002. I'm not sure what the timescale that was, but we are not close. We're falling close behind as UK, and the debate that we've seen on television from the various leaders of the various parties, there's hardly any love or respect for migrants coming to this country, or settlers, for want of a better word, which Siva is fond of using. I think that we need to rise to that challenge. I don't know where that we comes from. Either collectively, people who are engaged in this space needs to raise the debate to a level where people can understand. All I've seen is on the underground system is a host of I'm an immigrant, and there are a host of black faces, white faces, basically saying I contribute to this particular profession, and it's very, very kind of middle class bourgeois, if you like, in my analysis. There's hardly a voice from the hospitality sector, which is full of migrant people, who are undocumented in some cases, who are working and keep propping up the London economy. I think we need to raise that debate.
Anyone want to say anything? Do you want to make any comments? No?
No, just agree.
The person next to you then?
Thank you. I'm Sam. I'm a poet and teacher. I work with excluded young people, and I'm a fan of Seven Under. I wanted a couple of things. Was that there seems to be across the world really a kind of healthy distrust and hatred for the police, from sort of fuck the police upwards. But what I'm wondering on the left is there a model of another type of police force that's democratic and accountable? Because I just don't seem to see it, I think, in the criticisms of the police. I don't seem to see another model that might be workable in a different, maybe idealistic sense. Or whether we want to scrap the police as an idea altogether, I don't know. And secondly, I wonder if it's too provocative, or if it's real historically to look at those migrant detention centres that we have in this country and call them concentration camps. Because it seems to me, and I might be going too far, but we're locking up people on the basis of ethnicity and detaining them with no cause for complaint or any definite length of time. So I wondered what you felt about those two questions.
Do you wish to speak?
Well, in terms of sort of the police and whether it's corrupt, I mean, any reading of this.
I wasn't asking that question. No, I was saying, given that they are,
Are there models?
do we have an alternative model that is democratic and accountable, or do we?
Oh no, I can't answer that question.
Can I comment on
Well, yeah, let me, can I
that?
just...
Just an observation. And over the years, I've been a close supporter of the Institute, but there's something about the tone of the analysis that I don't find particularly helpful. Yeah? If there's a criticism of the state, what model do you propose? And one way of actually looking at the tone that you project is where you see examples of good practice, you should actually be the vehicle for celebrating that. And that's how you can start influencing. Because even within prisons, there are good prison practices, there are good prison officers, there are prisoners that leave the prison saying, that was the best experience of my life. I learned to, no, seriously, I learned to read, I established a relationship with a particular officer, yeah? Even within the centres that you're talking about, people forge good relationships. There are some professional people in those settings, because we're talking about human beings, yeah? I think that's my observation. And the other thing maybe I want to throw in here is the concept of harvesting, yeah? Some of you are familiar with that. If there's a climate in this country, or in any other country where that's hostile to migrants, and the migrants keep coming, then there's this concept of harvesting. Then this is the tax they have to pay. By being called. It's cruel, but I come from Nigeria, where that concept is actually almost an everyday occurrence. Yeah? Why do certain people keep going to places where they are not wanted.
Despair. I need to have something other.
Colin wants to say something. I would just like to respond to the question, which is, I think, a good provocation. Should we think about abolishing the police? I think that this has to be treated seriously as a real political question, and not a question of whether there are good or bad individuals working within these systems. Of course there are. But when you start talking about the police, then we're talking about police power. And what is that? Police power is the mode of order and social control that we have. My personal feeling is we can do better and we can do without it. But that then requires a very different kind of political analysis, and one that I think has to go back to, the question that Eddie put and that Colin and Jenny and Siva were putting on the table this morning, which is, what kind of society are we? We have to get down then into the deeper root causes and think about the politics of addressing those that then produces this question about the police. I think it's a really tough one, but one that we have to be willing at least to put into the political conversation. That is my view. Colin wants to say something as well.
Sorry, I'm not trying to deserve to have this, I want to dominate this conversation. I'm taking you on.
Listen, I've come from Bradford. It's okay. I started traveling at 7 o'clock. Right.
Welcome. Thank you. Okay, when I say this, a few years ago I was a teacher. I taught political economy as well as sociology. One of the things I used to say very on to students was, the state, yes, we're talking about actually the state here, the state is actually a tool that's supposed to be serving all the people in our society. The state, there's competition though for controlling how the state works. We're getting back to class. The state that is functioning in the way that is killing people, read the report. For those who haven't seen Dying for Justice, please, it is really not about figures. It's about the consequences of this happening. Yeah? A lot of the time is spent on talking about the people who struggle. I see Suresh back there, who every year leads a march from Trafalgar Square down the road about this stuff. It's multiplying. The suffering of the people, the madness that's introduced to their lives, yes, as a consequence of having to try to find out, desperate jungle, why is this happening to our people is awful. But back to the state. It seems to me the state is not something that's supposed to be controlled by the most backward elite people in our society. It's supposed to be something serving all people. So when we talk about the state, yes, we are against the state, we're actually about combating, yes, making struggle to change the state's practices. This is everything from the top to how the police behave in our communities. And there are ways, it seems to me there are people, there's a history of places, you know this, where people have decided in their localities to actually take on their police, to make their police accountable, responsible to them in those places. It can begin at that level. But when we're talking about the state and when we're talking about it here, we're talking about actually changing, understanding that as a class, if we're talking about working class people, we're talking about people who are seriously oppressed in our society. We have to make struggles so the state and its agencies and its apparatuses stops behaving in the way that it's behaving. Yes?
Sorry. We can't get to that. Okay.
There's a gentleman in the back. I'm sorry, go ahead. Have you been waiting? I'm sorry. I was looking over here. That's where all the talking was.
Yeah, I just want to, partly ends up coming back on that. My name's Ken Olende, I'm a journalist for Socialist Worker, and I've covered the Jimmy Mubenga thing, the case and so on. And I'm just saying, being at the inquest and being in court, one of the things which is most vital about what's happened is the fact that people at IRR have been there all the time, reporting on what's going on. These reports are really important, partly just coming back on that. You've got to talk about the good things that are done. Well, actually, I think there's lots of people who've been talking about the good things that are done. And what's really important is having people recording the bad things that are done. Because actually, while we in here might all agree on the bad things that are happening, it's amazing how many people don't know about it. And I think the things talking about, people mentioned David Olawale, and the fact that no one's been convicted since someone was convicted for over his death. No one was convicted over his death. they were convicted over, I think it was GBH that the cops were done for. It wasn't the killing. No one has been done for the killing. And I think that this kind of thing is actually really important. That's why it's so important that you have people who are prepared to stand up and talk about these things. Because if you look at the situation with Jimmy Mubenga, he died. People know how he died because he was crushed down till he choked. When the people were prosecuted over it, the officers were prosecuted, the company wasn't done for it. And I think that this is a really important issue because, as people have said, lots of cases come up where no one can actually be held individually responsible. The thing is to say, how is the state able to get away with these sorts of things? And I think it's not just about individual things about people in detention, though those are important. It is about the whole thing, about the whole racist system. And this goes back to the whole thing of people are talking about the Mediterranean, about people at Lampedusa. It's terrible what Katie Hopkins said, but actually she's pretty much irrelevant, I think, to things. I think it's really a shocking thing in terms of the government and the deaths in the Mediterranean is what Baroness Annerley said. It was Baroness Annerley who said the British government should not support continuation of rescues because it only encourages them. This is the thing where I think it's so vital that people like the IRR are here continually putting forward the thing that there is a racist thing, that you have to struggle over these things, because otherwise the state and the racism that's been associated with it just gets away with it.
Okay. Thank you. I do also want to encourage people to read the reports and to get them. This question of privatization is taken up very directly. The gentleman who has his hand up right now in the purple striped shirt, we'll take one last comment. Is this right? And then we'll take a little break.
My name is Gus John. I have maintained for some while that the police, the National Front, Britain First, and all of those neo-fascist groups lie along the same spectrum. That's my starting point. Suresh will know that I used to be head of an organization in Manchester called the Black Parents Movement. We worked in partnership with the Asian Youth Movement. And in Manchester, on a regular basis, we were dealing with cases where taxi drivers, Asian taxi drivers, would be murdered, racist murders. And in every case, one in Oldham that I remember, and the Southall Monitoring Group assisted us with that, another one in Longsight. The police would be called by the bereaved family. They would go in there, and rather than trying to establish the circumstances of the murder that might assist with their investigation, they turn the whole place inside out, trying to determine who of that family may be an illegal immigrant. So in the face of the people's bereavement, they are harassed by the state as to their status while the murderers go free. Sieber's aphorism about racism as discrimination, and the racism that discriminates and the racism that kills, is a useful one. But let's remember that when we're dealing with issues of policing, those two get conflated. There's not a sharp division between them. So when you consider how Christopher Alder died in Hull, when you consider how Roger Sylvester met his death in Tottenham, we have to remember that the police bring to their interactions with black people, and black males in particular, a mindset, a set of expectations in terms of what they believe society expects of them, which essentially rubbishes, dismisses the very humanity of the people they come into contact with. The same is true of stop and search. So that the issue of the police and what they do and how the state endorses that, and why it is that the society as a whole isn't more exercised about that, is what I think we're talking about here. Because let's remember, it is not all that long ago when police used to raid what they called shops where people made clothes and sweatshops and those sorts of things, to try and see how many people they could get. They do the same with restaurants up and down the land even now. How many people might be illegal immigrants? So there's a steady harassment of the population on that immigration narrative, which also explains people's attitude to people coming across the Mediterranean from Africa into Europe. So fundamentally, our major task is not only how we as organizations, IRR, etc., make the police accountable and inform the public about those deaths and the circumstances surrounding them, but how we ensure that the population as a whole does not allow those things to go on in its name.
Thank you.
Thank you,